Welcome to our live training. For this session, we're going to look at creating basic editor tools. So this is a very introductory look at the topic of editor scripting. So those of you who have worked in Unity before will be familiar with writing things like mono behaviors, which are scripts which control gameplay and will be compiled and shipped with your game when you publish your game to your platform of choice. But there is another side to scripting in Unity, which is scripts that we can write to customize our workflow when working in the Unity editor. And so we're going to take a look at some basic ideas to kind of get you started with that. Now, I know that for myself, I was working in Unity for quite a while before I even kind of stuck a toe into editor scripting. I kind of thought it would be like really complicated or difficult. And hopefully one of the points of this session is just to say, hey, take a look at this. It's really not that hard. Or at the very least, there are some useful, simple things that you can do with editor scripting that maybe you haven't thought of. So that's kind of the idea here. It's kind of a light and gentle introduction to the topic. I hear a few people in the chat looking for more advanced content on editor scripting, and your request has been noted. I would like to do some more advanced stuff as well, so we'll see if we can get that figured out. So, if a little kind of brief overview of what editor scripting is. So basically, when you're working in Unity, working with the UI in the Unity editor, this is all actually displayed using the editor scripting API. So all the windows and so on that you see are drawn using the same techniques that you can use to create your own custom editor tools. And if you've worked with any of the popular tools on the Unity Asset Store, things like Pro Builder or Playmaker or Shader Forge, which are these kind of quite robust tools with a lot of functionality with their own custom windows and custom graphical user interface. Those are all created using editor scripting. Now, we're not going to go anywhere near that deep in this session, but hopefully we can just kind of crack the door open and let you peek in and get an idea about some of the possibilities. So the real kind of key word for today's session is workflow. So it's about creating little tools to improve your workflow during the production process as you're working on your title. And this is really going to be useful whether you're a team of 1 or a team of 100, right? Especially as you get into larger teams where you have different disciplines who might need to do some work in the editor, whether those are artists or animators or UI artists or audio people, and maybe they're coming to the Unity editor without a programming background or a full knowledge of how all the different aspects of it work. You, as a developer, can create tools for them, both to make their lives easier, automate certain tasks, and to produce more error-free results. So we're going to do 3 little example scripts today. So the first script that we're going to look at is going to be what's called a watch folder. And so what this means is that we're going to create a folder which we can drop assets into and have their import settings be automatically changed. So in this case, we're going to create a folder called Sprites, and any texture asset we drop into that folder will have its texture type changed to Sprite automatically. And obviously you could set up multiple folders of different types for each of the different types of textures or other types of assets that you're importing, and to post-process those settings to be the settings that you need without having to do a bunch of manual clicking. The second 2 examples that we're going to look at are both what are called scriptable wizards. So scriptable wizards are little windows that you can pop up in the editor and can have up to 2 buttons and will allow you to click a button and to execute a series of commands. So do a bunch of stuff in the editor. The first one that we're going to look at is going to be super simple. It's going to allow you to select objects by tag in the hierarchy. And the second is going to be a kind of an automated checklist for creating content in the hierarchy. So if you've ever worked on a game where you have to create like multiple variations on things, like multiple power-ups or pickup objects or characters or enemies or inventory items, you may have had this experience of duplicating things, changing the settings, copying settings between components, setting references, forgetting to set some references or forgetting to retag things, and thereby, introducing, first of all, there's a lot of kind of drudgery that you don't want to do. And second, it's really easy to introduce errors and mistakes into your process. So by having a little scriptable wizard that will just, add a series of things in sequence and set up any references that you need, you can both make things faster and less full of errors. So those are going to be our three little examples that we're going to do. Like I said, very basic. And so let's dive in. So the first thing that we're going to need to do in our assets folder is to create a new folder. I'm going to select the assets folder, right click and choose create folder. And we're going to call this folder editor with a capital E. So any editor scripts that we want to run need to be created in this folder. And importantly, we do not want to place other scripts like mono behaviors in this folder. You'll get actually an error if you try to do it. So I'm going to open our new editor folder, right click, create C# script, and this first script is going to be called Sprite Processor. And we're going to double click it to open it. And so the first thing about our Sprite processor is that we are going to add the first thing I'm going to do is pull up my notes. Here we go. So the first thing about our Sprite processor, or when we want to write any type of editor script, is that we're going to want to add the using Unity editor namespace declaration. And what this allows us to do is allows us to access classes that are in the Unity editor namespace. And one of those is the asset post processor class. So in this case, instead of inheriting from a mono behavior like many scripts we're used to do, we're going to inherit or derive from the asset post processor class. And this has some functions and some variables that we're going to use in our Sprite processor. So the next thing that we can do is delete the start and update functions, right? We're not going to be using those. And so we're going to have one function in this class, and it's going to be void on post process texture. And it's going to take a parameter of the type texture2D called texture. And so on post process texture is going to be called anytime a texture is imported and has its pre-processing completed. So there's also actually an on pre-process texture event that you can use if you want to do things like change the compression settings or other things that you need to do before the texture is imported. But in this case, to set the type, we're going to use on post-process texture. So this is going to be called anytime a texture is imported into our project. And so the first thing that we're going to do in this function is we are going to declare a string variable called lowercase asset path. And this is going to be equal to asset path dot to lower. So what we're doing is we're getting the asset path, which is a string, and we're going to convert it all to lowercase. And if you're wondering where is this asset path coming from, it's coming from the base class, which is this asset post processor. And if at any point you want to figure out what are the other variables available in this base class, you can select it, right click, and choose Go to Declaration, or press F12. And this will open up the class, and we can see in this case, Asset Postprocessor has an asset importer variable, an asset path, and a texture 2D preview. So in this case, we're using this public string asset path, and that is the path to the asset. So where in our project folder this asset is located once it's been imported. And so in this case, we're going to convert that to lowercase and store it in our lowercase, oh, I made a typo, our lowercase asset path string. Okay. Next, we're going to declare a Boolean called is in Sprite's directory. And this is going to be equal to lowercase asset path dot index of. And we're going to pass into index of sprites, like so. And so what we're doing here is index of allows us to go through a string and to compare a substring to that string. So to see, does this string sprites appear somewhere in our path? So the cool thing about this is you could actually have your sprites folder wherever in your project, or you could have several of them as long as they're called sprites. So it could be, player art, textures, sprites, and then enemy art, textures, sprites. And those would both be read as, okay, this is a sprites folder, as long as it's named sprites. And so index of will return an integer, and it will return a value of -1 if the string is not matched at all. If that string is not found in the string we're trying to check, it's going to return a -1. So in this case, we're checking if this has not returned a -1, it means that it's found this sprites substring in our lowercase asset path string. Therefore, we're going to set is in sprites directory to true, right? So our texture that we just imported is in fact in the sprites directory. Then we're going to say if is in sprites directory and do the following. So for some reason, my mono developer is like really unresponsive right now. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to declare a variable of the type texture importer called texture importer. And we're going to set that to equal our asset importer. Remember, this is the asset importer that we saw in the base class. But what we're going to do is we are going to cast it to texture importer. Texture importer. Then we're going to take that texture importer variable and we're going to say texture importer dot texture type equals texture importer type dot sprite. Okay, so we're going to, every time any texture is imported into the project, we're going to store its asset path in a string, check to see if that string contains our sprites substring. If it does, we're going to get a reference to the texture importer and then set the texture type to sprite. So let's save that and jump back over to Unity. And so the first thing that we're going to do is in our assets folder, we are going to right click, create folder, and create a new folder called, you guessed it, sprites. Whoops, sprites. And I'm going to pull in a texture that I have here, which is this bomb sprite. And first of all, I'm not going to put it in the watch folder. So I'm going to drag it in, and I'm just going to drop it right in the assets folder. And we can see that it comes in as a texture, right? So it's not ready to be used in our UI or whatever we might need a sprite for, right? So let's delete that. And now I'm going to bring it, same texture, and drop it in to our sprites folder. And now we can see, if we highlight it, that it's immediately had its texture type set to Sprite. Now, just for fun, if we highlight our asset post processor and use control single quote to open it, to search for it in the documentation, we can take a look at the class and we can see that there are all these different messages that we can use. So on post process all assets, asset bundle name changed, on post process audio, game object with user properties, model, speed tree, sprites, texture, and then we also have these pre-processed versions, animation, audio, model, speed tree, texture, and so many different opportunities to pre-process or post-process your assets as you import them. So yeah, that's our kind of like super simple little asset post-processing example. Obviously, you can get as complicated as you want with it. But this is just like a nice, very, tiny little script, easy idea that can just help save you a bunch of boring setup work. All right, let me take a look at the chat and see how everybody's doing over there, and then we'll move on to our next example. Yes, this will work if you place multiple images at the same time in this folder. Yep. Tomo Prime, no, the folder string match is not case sensitive. Actually, you notice, right? I'm checking for a lowercase string here, and I had an uppercase folder name. That's because we're converting any asset path to lowercase. Yes, and as Tylo Tungsten said, this method fires for every texture that's dropped into any folder, anywhere in the project. As soon as you drop a texture into Unity and it imports, this on post-process texture gets called, and it checks the path of that to see if it's in the sprites path. So it gets called for every texture. Rick Wild asks, is on post-process, meaning on post-process texture, automatically called like update? Well, yes, in the sense that it's automatically called, just it's called when an image, a texture is finished importing. Whereas update is called every frame when the editor is in play mode. Hugo said Nax asks, if you change the code now, the texture that you placed before won't be affected, right? That's correct, because on post-process texture only gets fired right after a texture is imported. So another thing, right, if I took a texture that I dropped into the assets folder and then moved it into the sprites folder, it would also not get turned into a sprite, right? Because it's already been imported into a different folder. So it gets called once for each texture at the moment that they're imported into the Unity project, aka dropped into the editor. All right, so let's continue. So that's an asset post processor. The next thing that we are going to take a look at is creating a scriptable wizard. So let's jump back over to our editor folder, and we are going to create a new C# script, and we're going to call this select all of tag. And so this is going to be our scriptable wizard to select things by tag. Just a minute. Okay. So the first thing that we need to do is to make sure that we add the using Unity editor namespace declaration, right? We're going to need that for all editor scripts. So we can delete the start and update methods, and we're going to, instead of inheriting from mono behavior, we are going to inherit from scriptable wizard. So in our scriptable wizard, the main first function that we're going to need is a static function that returns void called select all of tag wizard. And so select all of tag wizard is going to be called by a menu item, right? Because it's an editor script. So we're going to add the menu item attribute. And so we're going to choose where we want this to appear. So this is going to be in a menu called My Tools. That'll be new. And the menu entry will be called select all of capital O. Let's do capital. Select all of tag. And now we can save and just see that. Super basic, but I'll just go step by step. So now we'll see that the My Tools window, the My Tools menu has appeared in the editor, and we now have an entry called select all of tag. And if we click it, nothing happens, right? Because there's no code in this function yet. So, but really just like adding a menu item to the editor is that simple, right? You just declare a static function and give it the menu item attribute with the menu you want it to appear in, which is kind of fun. All right, so in this case, we're going to use scriptable wizard dot display wizard, and we're going to pass in the generic parameter select all of tag, the name of the class. And then for the parameters, we're going to have first the title of the window, which is going to be select all of tag, and then the title of the first button, which if you look in the IntelliSense here, it refers to as string create button name. So by default in a scriptable wizard, we're going to be referring to the create button, which is like button 1, and the other button, which is button 2. So anytime you see create button or other button, you could just think of those as the first button and the second button. So for the create button name, we're going to pass in make selection. Okay. And so now that is going to draw our window for us, right? So if we choose now, we go to My Tools and do select all of tag. Now we've got this nice little window with a button. And if we click make selection, it's going to throw this error. It's going to say onWizard create has not been implemented in script. And so it's expecting another function called onWizard create that it can call when we click that button. So let's declare, you guessed it, onWizard create. And so onWizard create, this is going to be really simple. What we're going to do is we're going to create an array of game objects called game objects. And we're going to store in it, we're going to fill it using GameObject.findGameObjects, plural, find game objects with tag. We're going to pass into find game objects with tag a string, which is the tag that we're going to search for. And we're going to set that in a public string variable. So we'll call this search tag. So we're going to have a public string called search tag, and we'll initialize it to say your tag here. And we'll pass that to find game objects with tag. And then, so what that's going to do, right, is that's going to search we could do this in a mono behavior as well, right? You can use find game objects with tag at runtime as well. In this case, we're using it at edit time. So we're going to find game objects with tag and store all of those objects in our array game objects. Then we're going to use selection. Now, selection is part of the editor namespace, right? So we're going to say selection.objects. And this is going to be, as it said there, the actual, let's get the IntelliSense back up so we can read it, the actual unfiltered selection from the scene, right? So this is going to be this is going to allow us to control what objects are selected in the scene. So we're going to say selection.objects equals game objects. And that's all we need to do. Save, jump back to Unity, clear this error. And now if we go to my tools, choose select all of tag, and then type, for example, player, click make selection, it will select the game object tagged player. Let's go to our HUD canvas here and select all these HUD objects, and I'm going to tag those as UI element, which is just a little tag I made for the purpose of this training. Deselect them, and then we're going to choose my tools, select all of tag, UI element, and it will select all of those, right? So it can select single or multiple game objects with the tag. And if you've ever worked in like big scenes with lots of stuff where you're using tags heavily, this is something that you definitely might find useful. It's definitely something that I have found useful in my personal projects, where, you know, I'm like instantiating thousands and thousands of objects in the scene, and like scrolling through the hierarchy to find stuff can be really tricky, but searching by name is not always the easy way to do it. So searching by tag can be useful as well. Okay, so that's our first like little simple scriptable wizard. Let's take a look at the chat real quick. I'm just going to scroll back a little. If you got new questions, ask them now. Sweet. That was super easy. Wow, yeah. That's baby Logos 2323. That's kind of the point of this session, right? Just to show you like they're actually super useful, super easy things you can do in the editor. Yes, and as BatXbox points out, if no elements with that tag are in the scene, an exception will be thrown. Yeah, let's just show that real quick. So if I try to go look for select all of tags, asdast, make selection, it's going to show me an error, Unity exception tag asdast is not defined. So if you make a typo, it'll throw an error, so it won't just like silently fail. The other thing, just to like complain for a second, the other thing that I found annoying, if you try to search for untagged, it just does nothing, even though there are plenty of things that are untagged. I think untagged here is just kind of like a cover up for a null, which kind of sucks. But FYI. Remember, guys, if you're typing in a tag, right, it's got to match exactly. I see somebody saying player is not a tag. It's because you got a lowercase p. It's a string, right? So it's very, very literal. All right. So let's do our third tool, our second scriptable wizard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in my editor, actually not in my editor folder, in my scripts folder, I'm going to create a new C# script called character. Now this is really just like a dummy holder class. So this last example is going to be like quite skeletal, just to give you like an idea for a workflow more than like an actual system. So let's say we have a character class, right, that holds information about our character. This is a mono behavior, right? So we're going to jump over to monodevelop, and we're going to add some public variables here. So we're going to have a public texture 2D called portrait. We're going to have a public string called nickname, and a public color called color. And lastly, a public player movement variable called player movement. So none of these are actually going to do anything when we're done with them. They're all just like examples of data that you might want to set in your character, right? So this is all that's going to be in the script. It's just like little dummy holder script. Okay, so we're going to say, so this is a mono behavior, right? This is not an editor script. This is a component that will be attached to our character when we create it. So what we're doing here is we're going to create a character. We're going to create a scriptable wizard that will create a new game object, add the needed components, in this character component being one of them, set all of these public variables, the portrait, nickname, and color, and player movement and add a player movement component and set the player movement variable with a reference to that component. So that's kind of like the big picture of what we're about to do. So this character script is going to be a mono behavior attached to our character that we're going to create. I'm going to save it and jump back to our editor folder. So in our editor folder, now we're going to write our new scriptable wizard that's going to use that character class. So we're going to create a C# script, and we're going to call it, what did I call this? Create character wizard. And then we're going to open it up. Again, right, we're going to add the namespace declaration using Unity Editor, and we're going to inherit from scriptable wizard. And we are going to delete start and update. All right. So now we are going to declare our first create wizard function that is going to display the wizard when we select it from the menu item. So we're going to declare a static function that returns void called create wizard. And this is going to also have the menu item attribute. And in this case, it's going to also be from the My Tools menu. And the entry will be called create character wizard. So now we can call create character wizard. We can call create wizard from the menu. And now within that function, we're going to call scriptable wizard dot display wizard again, pass in create character wizard as the type of window that we want to display. And here we're going to use our two buttons instead of just one. So first of all, we're going to give the wizard window a title, which will be create character. The create button is going to be called create new. And the other button, you see here we have a string parameter for the other button name. The other button name is going to be called update selected. Okay, so now when we display our window, we're going to have the title, create character, a create new button, and an update selected button. So I showed you those last time, so I'm not going to jump back to Unity to show them. We're going to move right on to our onWizard create button, our onWizard create function. So we're going to declare private function that returns void called onWizard create. And onWizard create, you remember, will be called when we press that first button, the create button. So here we're going to do the main meat of the script. So we're going to, first of all, create a new game object variable called character.go, and that is going to be equal to a new game object, right? So this is going to create a new empty game object in the scene. And then we are going to declare a variable of the type character called character component. And that's going to be equal to character.go dot add component character. So we are going to create this new object, add the character component to it, and then set the variables of the character component. So we're going to say character component dot portrait equals the fields that we haven't defined yet. So now we're going to create some public variables for the data that we actually want to set. So we're going to make a public texture 2D called portrait texture. We're going to have a public color called color and set that to default to color.white. And then we're going to have a public texture 2D called, oh no, we had that already. We're going to have a public string called nickname, and we'll set that to default nickname. So now we're going to set the in the character component that we've added, we're going to set the character component's public variable portrait to equal portrait texture. And then we're going to do the same thing for color. So the color of the character component is going to be equal to the color in the scriptable wizard, and character component dot nickname is going to be equal to nickname, right? So we're going to take the data from the scriptable wizard and pass it down into the character component that we added to the new game object. Next, we're going to add our player movement controller. So we're going to say player movement. We're going to declare a variable of the type player movement called player movement, and we're going to have that equal character go dot add component player movement. So we're adding the component and storing a reference to it in the player movement variable. Then we're going to say character component dot player movement equals player movement, right? So we added the component, and now we're going to set the reference in the character component to that component that we just added. All right. So why don't we just look at what that looks like? We're going to save, jump back, and now if we go to My Tools, choose Create Character Wizard, we can see we have fields for the portrait texture, color, and nickname. And if we set those, let's use our bomb sprite. We'll set the color to a lovely red, and the nickname, we'll call him Bommy. And then we're going to go ahead and hit Create New, and that's going to make a new game object appear in the hierarchy. And we can see it's got the character component added. The fields on the character component have been set up correctly. It's added the player movement component and set the reference in character to the player movement script. So that's pretty cool. And obviously I'm showing you like the micro compact version of this with just a couple of variables. But if you have done this in your own games, you'll know that oftentimes, like if you have like an enemy, they end up with like 40 million different components attached to them. You know, I like to break my things up into like small individual components, but then sometimes you end up with so many that like it's easy to forget, like, oh, this guy doesn't have this attached, and then there's weird errors or stuff is going wrong. So you can kind of have like an automated checklist using a scriptable wizard. So the couple little small pieces of functionality we're going to add to it. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to implement void on wizard other button. And this, you guessed it, is going to be called when we press the other button, in this case labeled update selected. And here what we're going to do is we're going to check if, no, not security, geez, typing skills. If selection dot active transform does not equal null, meaning do we have something selected? And if we do, then we're going to say character, we're going to declare again a variable called character component, and we're going to set that to equal selection dot active transform dot get component. Boy, typing skills really on the ropes here. Get component character. So again, we're using pretty familiar stuff from your gameplay scripting where we're using get component and things like that. But in this case, instead of having it be like this game object, we're using selection dot active transform, right? So we're manipulating data in the scene by saying, okay, the object we want to target is the active selected one, and then we're going to use get component to get a reference to its attached component. So next, we're going to check if character component does not equal null, meaning we selected something. When we selected it, we selected something, clicked the button, It checked to see if there was a character component attached. There was, meaning character component was not null. And now we're going to set all its fields again. And in fact, we can just be lazy and just copy all this. Boop. And so what this is going to do is when we click Update Selected, whatever values are currently stored in the scriptable wizard window will be transferred to the game object. Okay. The last bit is just a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to call void on wizard update. So this is going to be called anytime the window is redrawn. And we are going to set help string to equal enter character details. And this is just going to display a little help string for us. And help string is part of the scriptable wizard class, which we can look at quickly since we're curious. So we've got strings for create button name, error string, help string is valid, other button name, etc. So we are going to set the help string to say enter your character details, and we're going to add this function for onWizard other button to transfer the values from the wizard to the game object when update selected is pressed. So save, jump back to Unity. We've got our new game object selected. Let's open our create character wizard. We'll set this to a lovely green color. Just choose this heart. And we'll change his default nickname to Hardy. And choose update selected, and we can see that the values are indeed updated, and our little message is displayed up here at the top of the window for the help string. So yeah, that is our kind of basic dip your toe in at the shallow end intro to creating basic editor tools. I hope that you found it helpful. We do have a couple sessions on, there's a session on property drawers that Adam Buckner did that you can check out if you want something a little more advanced. And there are a few bits and pieces on the Unity Learn site. I would like to flesh that out and give you guys some more editor scripting tools if there's a demand for it. So if you guys are interested, let me know. And as always, great to see all the regulars, and welcome to all the new people in the chat. Love to see you there. And thanks so much for watching. So I'm going to take a little minute to hang out in the chat and take some questions. I'll put the code back on the screen. And let's see what we got. Baby Laga says it's very powerful. I'm glad you think so. Yeah, I mean, you know, the other thing I want to emphasize about this, right, is what's really powerful. Like, for me, I'm not actually working on a game on the stream here, right? So this is all kind of just like surface level stuff. And more importantly, I'm not working on your game, right? So I don't know what tools you need, but you know what tools you need. And hopefully in seeing this, you can recognize like, oh man, I'm always having to do this repetitive task, or I hate laying out these kind of things, or I hate having to like do this. And you can create a super specific editor tool that will serve that need and make your life easier and save you time. And you can see, right? I mean, I just did 3 of these in 45 minutes. I mean, obviously I know what I'm doing already, but like you can make these things quickly. And if you consider like that you might be working on your project for a year, 2 years, 3 years, you know, the amount of times you might do some of these repetitive things, you could probably shave a couple of months off your project by having some good tooling. You know, an example of this that I saw not too long ago that I thought was pretty cool. I was on William Cheer, who's working on Manifold Garden. I was on his stream, and he one of the guys on his team made a tree generator that would like generate these kind of blocky trees in his art style. That was not a runtime thing. It was an editor tool. So he could like click tree, and it would like give him a bunch of variations on a tree, and then he could pick one and put it in his level. So that is definitely that's a whole cool, the whole procedural content direction is a really interesting way to go with this. A lot of the focus is on people generating random levels at runtime or random content at runtime. But obviously you could generate cool content at edit time and then be able to, pick between it and edit it down and be like, oh, I really like this weird thing that it generated, but I'm going to cut off the end or whatever. So a lot of really cool possibilities here and stuff that could be like really specific to what your project needs. I think it's like the real power of this, more than like me showing you, random scripts. It's like figuring out what you need and making it. Destrozates asked, I noticed that the newly created game object was named game object. Can you rename it using the nickname value? Yeah, you totally could. I mean, the point is you could do a lot, right? You could do anything, almost. You totally could name it. Yep, as Philip Folick says, you can create a game object with a string parameter, which will be the game object name. Yep. Hybrid Spida asks, at Unity Tech, is it possible / easy to create a UI interface like that of the animator controller where you are able to visually link different objects together? Possible, yes. Easy, I would say not. I haven't tried it, so don't let me discourage you, but any tool that you see on the asset store, stuff like Playmaker, Shader Forge, all that stuff is all done with editor scripting. So the short answer is yes. Is it easy? Depends how skilled you are. That part is hard to answer, but is it possible? Yes. EB Talks asks, do you think extending the editor is really necessary or just really useful? That I cannot answer that question for you. I would like to think that Unity as a product is capable of doing what you need to do so that it's not necessary, that you could do all this stuff yourself without editor scripting, and plenty of people do make whole games without editor scripting. But it's kind of like, could you carry all those rocks up a hill by yourself? Sure. You could also use a wheelbarrow that would be like nice and easy, That's kind of why mankind invented tools, right? To make hard jobs easier. So I would say not necessary, but yeah, useful. Oh, that's a cool example. Yeah, C. Strachan says, I use this for aligning objects in a 2D game. Snap 2 was just not good enough. Drop a bunch of sprites, hit the button, everything aligns up. That's a great example, right? It's like you're spending a lot of time dragging these sprites and trying to get them all aligned, and you're doing that again and again. Make a little tool, boop, and it just works. Andy Uran says, I did one editor window for AI behaviors. It wasn't that bad. Making it look as good as the animator controller would be more work. Yeah, I would say that's a good way to look at it. Like you could get something simple and maybe not gorgeous going in a pretty straightforward way, but then if you wanted to polish it up, if you were like making a commercial asset, it would probably be more work. Emotion Theory says, just remember your editor tools, if polished up, can be great stuff to put on the asset store. Yeah. I mean, especially if you put some time into it and like make some nice UI. The only thing I would say is if you put stuff on the asset store, you got to be prepared to support it, right? People are going to ask for questions and features and stuff. So just know that in advance. But yeah, you could make some money. I mean, there are some people who have really like been able to bankroll parts of their production selling tools that they made for that production. I think the guys doing the Ultimate FPS, that's not an editor tool, right? But those guys did pretty well with that. And I know Joachim Holmer, he's now working on his VR game Budget Cuts, but he was, he made Shader Forge, and I think really made some money with it. So it's definitely can be a thing, but it's you want to do a good job if you're going to do it. What is my favorite type of bagel and why? My favorite type, that's easy. My favorite type of bagel is an everything bagel because not only does it have garlic, onions, sesame seeds, but it has everything else. And it's delicious. And I like to have it with vegetable cream cheese. Thank you very much. If you're ever in a position to buy me a bagel, now you know what I like. And I like a black iced coffee with 1 sugar. Thank you for asking the difficult and important questions. Portal 17 asks, I'm wondering if in a custom editor there's a way to display editable shapes. If you look, it's like from 2011, but there's a video from Unite 2011 that Tim Cooper and Sean White did about, which is also called like Intro to Editor Scripting. And they make a pretty cool little tiny, almost like Photoshop, not Photoshop, like but a little pixel editor in a custom window. And that is the closest thing I can think of as a resource to look at for Portal 17. Hydrogen, sure, send it to me on Twitter. I'd like to see what you're working on. I'd like to see what everybody's working on. Send me a link to your stuff. If you guys want to get in touch with me, at me on Twitter. That's like the fastest way. I'm always on there all day long. Did I show my Twitter again? My Twitter is @MattMirrorFish. That's my Twitter, but yes, I'll put it on the screen again because we're kind of done looking at stuff. There's all of the official Twitterers. All right, how are we doing on time? Okay, it's 5:30. So I'll stick around. I'll take 5 more minutes of questions. If you've got some, throw them at me, and I'll try my best to answer. Oh yeah, guys, everybody, post your stuff with Screenshot Saturday and Made with Unity. I love those hashtags. I'm always in there. I post my stuff, my personal work outside of my work for Unity in there all the time. Screenshot Saturday is a hashtag where people tag their screenshot and animated GIF posts on Twitter. And a lot of people look at it and retweet it and stuff. And it's a nice place to share like visual media for game dev on Twitter. Most active on Saturday, but I also use it like throughout the week. People don't seem to mind. So I'm going to cut the stream. I'll keep the window open if there's stuff that I can answer in there. Thanks everybody again for joining. Always a pleasure to see you. And yeah, send me your stuff on Twitter. Post your stuff on Screenshot Saturday. That's always fun. And enjoy the rest of your day or night, depending on where you are. Bye.